This is the remarkable story of Ella Green, a determined lawyer who stood against systemic prejudice in the small town of Coldwater to defend Mia Thompson, a young woman wrongfully accused of robbery. Through grit and unwavering resolve, Ella dismantled a web of bias and injustice, turning a seemingly hopeless case into a catalyst for change. This tale is not just about proving innocence. It's about standing up against a broken system and inspiring an entire community to seek fairness and truth. Before we dive into this gripping tale of justice, courage, and transformation, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this powerful and inspiring story, don't forget to subscribe. Ella Green felt the weight of the town's judgment before leaving her car. Driving through the narrow streets of Coldwater, a sleepy southern town, she noticed how even the faintest movement seemed to draw attention. The rows of aging homes, their once bright colors faded into muted shades of beige and gray, bore witness to decades of wear and, perhaps, neglect. As Ella passed by, pedestrians turned to stare openly. Their expressions ranged from mild curiosity to outright suspicion, their eyes narrowing as they registered the sight of a black woman in a sleek, dark car. Coldwater wasn't welcoming to strangers, and certainly not to someone like Ella. The tension grew more palpable as she neared the town square, where the courthouse stood in imposing silence. Its towering white columns and meticulously maintained facade screamed authority and power. Yet, Ella knew too well what that power represented in a place like this. A system rigged against people like her, where prejudice wasn't just tolerated but celebrated. She parked near the courthouse steps, her hands gripping the steering wheel momentarily longer than necessary. Ella had dealt with bias and discrimination before, both overt and subtle. But something about this town felt different. The racism here wasn't masked by fake politeness or perfunctory smiles. Instead, it was worn openly, like a badge of honor. Drawing a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders. There was no room for hesitation. Ella was here for one reason: to defend Mia Thompson, a young black woman accused of robbery, a crime that, as Ella would soon uncover, she likely hadn't committed. As Ella stepped out of the car, her sharp heels clicking against the pavement, she caught sight of a group of older men seated on a bench near the courthouse entrance. They whispered amongst themselves, their gazes locked onto her. Their scrutiny followed her every step, but Ella refused to let it slow her stride. She adjusted her navy blazer, each step deliberate, projecting confidence even as the heat of their stares bore into her back. The courthouse doors loomed ahead, heavy wooden barriers that groaned in protest as she pushed them open. Inside, the cool air provided temporary relief from the oppressive heat outside, but it did little to ease Ella's unease. A quick room scan confirmed what she already suspected: she was the only black person present. Her heels echoed as she went to the security checkpoint, where a broad-shouldered officer stood. His uniform was immaculate, his demeanor anything but welcoming. "Identification," he barked, his tone clipped and devoid of warmth. Ella handed him her ID, her face impassive as she waited for him to finish his inspection. The officer's frown deepened as he examined the card, then looked up at her. His gaze was sharp, almost accusatory. "Where are you going?" he demanded. Ella met his eyes, refusing to flinch. "I'm here for the Thompson case," she replied evenly. "I'm the defense attorney." The officer's eyes narrowed. He took a deliberate step back, scanning her up and down as if searching for something that didn't fit. "You don't look like a lawyer," he remarked, his lips curving into a smirk. Ella's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "And what exactly does a lawyer look like?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. His smirk widened, the insult hanging in the air between them. "Not like you." The exchange drew attention, and Ella could feel the weight of every gaze in the room. Her pulse quickened, but she refused to show weakness. "If there's an issue, I suggest you take it up with the judge," she said, her tone firm. "But until then, you need to let me through." The officer hesitated, glancing around the room. The silence was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Finally, as if he had nothing to lose, he stepped in front of her, blocking her path entirely. "I think you should leave, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with false politeness. Ella felt anger surge through her veins, but she channeled it into resolve. Her voice dropped, low but unyielding. "I'm not leaving. I have a right to be here, and I won't let you or anyone else deny my client the defense she deserves. The officer's jaw tightened, his posture growing more threatening. Before Ella could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the standoff. "What's going on here?" a voice called out. Ella turned to see a middle-aged man in a crisp suit striding toward them. His expression was serious as his gaze flicked between her and the officer. "She's trying to get into the courthouse," the officer said, as though the statement explained everything. The man frowned, turning to Ella. "And you are?" "Ella Green," she replied, handing him her card. "I'm here to defend Mia Thompson." The man's eyes widened slightly as he examined the card. Ella could practically see the gears turning in his head, calculating how to de-escalate the situation without causing a scene. "Is there a problem?" Ella asked sharply. The man cleared his throat. "No problem, just a misunderstanding." He shot a warning look at the officer, who scowled but stepped aside. "Please, right this way, Miss Green." Ella didn't miss the cold glare the officer shot her as she walked past, but she ignored it. She had more important battles ahead. As the man led her down the courthouse hallway, he spoke in hushed tones, his voice tinged with unease. "I apologize for the inconvenience. Things here can be tense, but I assure you the judge will give your client a fair trial." Ella resisted the urge to laugh. She knew better than to trust empty promises, especially in a town like Coldwater. "I'll hold you to that," she replied coolly. The man stepped aside when they reached the courtroom doors, offering a weak smile. "I'll see you inside." Ella nodded and pushed the heavy doors open. The courtroom was small and antiquated, its wooden benches worn from years of use. The faint scent of old books and dust lingered in the air. A handful of people were already seated, mostly older white men who barely acknowledged her presence. Ella made her way to the defense table, setting down her briefcase and organizing her notes. She could feel the weight of judgment in every glance, but she refused to let it distract her. This wasn't going to be easy. But Ella hadn't come here for easy. She'd come to fight. Ella Green's first moments inside the courtroom reinforced everything she had suspected about Coldwater. The unspoken tension in the room was thick, tangible, and aimed squarely at her. As she finished organizing her notes at the defense table, she became acutely aware of the stares from the opposing side. The prosecutor, Matthew Crane, sat at his table, his neatly pressed suit and air of self-importance fitting perfectly into the courthouse's austere surroundings. Crane's gaze lingered on Ella, his lips pressed into a tight line that bordered on a smirk. To him, Ella wasn't just a defense attorney, she was an outsider, an anomaly that disrupted the status quo. Ella held his gaze for a moment, refusing to back down. This was a game she had played before, and she had no intention of losing. The courtroom doors opened again, and all eyes turned as Mia Thompson was escorted in. The young woman looked fragile, her hands cuffed in front of her as a bailiff led her to the defense table. She wore an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, her eyes red and swollen from crying. When she saw Ella, a flicker of hope crossed her face, but it was quickly extinguished as her gaze swept over the courtroom, taking in the cold, indifferent faces of the spectators. Ella stood and approached her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Mia," she said softly, "I'm Ella Green, your attorney. We're going to get through this together, all right?" Mia nodded weakly, her voice barely audible. "I just want to go home," she whispered, her words trembling with fear and exhaustion. "I know," Ella replied gently, placing a comforting hand on Mia's arm. "And we're going to make that happen. Just trust me." As the judge entered the room, the bailiff called the court to order. Judge Robert Stanton, an older man with a stern expression and sharp, piercing eyes, took his seat at the bench. His gaze swept across the courtroom, landing briefly on Ella before settling on Mia. "Be seated," he commanded, his gravelly voice echoing through the room. Ella and Mia sat down, and Ella's focus shifted to the prosecutor, who rose from his seat to deliver his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Crane began, his tone dripping with confidence. "The case before you today is simple. The evidence is clear, and the facts are undeniable. On the night in question, the defendant, Mia Thompson, entered Coldwater Grocery, armed with a weapon and intent on robbing the store. She threatened the life of the store clerk and stole money from the cash register before fleeing the scene. The evidence will show beyond a shadow of a doubt that she is guilty of this crime." Crane's words were sharp and precise, and each syllable was carefully chosen to paint Mia as a calculating criminal. He presented her as someone who had premeditated the robbery, ignoring the reality of her circumstances or the lack of solid evidence against her. Ella felt her pulse quicken as Crane continued, his tone growing more self-assured with every sentence. He ended his statement with a dramatic flourish, turning to the jury. "Justice demands that we hold Mia Thompson accountable for her actions." It was Ella's turn. She rose smoothly from her seat, adjusting the front of her navy blue blazer as she stepped toward the jury box. "Good morning," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "My name is Ella Green, and I have the privilege of representing Mia Thompson." She paused, letting her words settle in the air before continuing. "Over the course of this trial, you will hear many things: accusations, assumptions, and speculation. But I ask you to focus on the facts, the evidence, and the truth. Mia Thompson is not a criminal. She is a daughter, a sister, and a friend, a young woman who found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the evidence will show that she did not commit the crime she has been accused of." Ella made a point to look at each juror, her gaze steady and direct. "You will hear from witnesses who will testify to Mia's character, to the kind of person she is. You will see that the so-called evidence against her is circumstantial at best, based more on preconceived notions and stereotypes than on any solid proof." She let her voice soften slightly, adding a note of humanity to her appeal. "I ask that you keep an open mind. Look beyond the surface. Look beyond the fear and bias that so often cloud our judgment. At the end of this trial, I am confident that you will see the truth, that Mia Thompson is not guilty." Ella returned to her seat, feeling the weight of the courtroom's collective gaze. She had set the stage, but she knew the real battle was only beginning. The first witness called to the stand was Earl Simmons, the store clerk who had been working the night of the robbery. Simmons was a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a nervous demeanor. As he was sworn in, Ella studied him closely, searching for cracks in his composure. Prosecutor Crane began his questioning. "Mr. Simmons, can you describe what happened on the night of the robbery?" Simmons cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting on the stand. "I was working the late shift like I always do. It was a little after midnight when she came in. She looked nervous, kept glancing around like she was looking for someone." "And what did you do when you noticed this?" Crane prompted. "I kept an eye on her from behind the counter. I tried to stay calm, but something felt off," Simmons replied, his voice trembling slightly. "Then what happened?" "She came up to the counter, pulled out a gun, and told me to give her the money," Simmons said, his words rushing out in a nervous flurry. "I didn't want any trouble, so I gave her everything in the register," Crane nodded, satisfied. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. No further questions." Ella stood, her heels clicking softly on the floor as she approached the witness stand. "Mr. Simmons," she began, her tone steady, "you mentioned that the person who robbed you appeared nervous. Can you describe that in more detail?" Simmons blinked, seemingly caught off guard. "She was fidgety, kept looking around, wouldn't make eye contact." "Would you say she looked scared?" Ella asked, tilting her head slightly. "I guess so," Simmons admitted hesitantly. Ella took a step closer. "And you also mentioned that she had a gun. Did you get a clear look at it?" Simmons hesitated. "It was dark. I didn't get a very good look, but it was small and black." "Could it have been something else? A phone, perhaps? Or a wallet?" Simmons shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I suppose it's possible." Ella nodded, her expression neutral. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. No further questions." As Ella returned to her seat, she caught the slight unease in the jurors' expressions. The seed of doubt had been planted, but she knew the prosecution would come back swinging. This was only the beginning of a long, grueling battle. The morning air in the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the second day of the trial began. Ella Green sat at the defense table, her hands folded calmly, though her mind worked tirelessly. Across the room, Matthew Crane prepared to call his next witness. The prosecution's strategy was clear: overwhelm the jury with circumstantial evidence and exploit Coldwater's deep-seated biases. Ella knew she had to counter every move, staying sharp and methodical. Judge Robert Stanton entered the courtroom, and everyone rose, His voice carried authority as he called the court to order. "Mr. Crane, you may call your next witness." Crane adjusted his tie and rose smoothly. "The prosecution calls Officer Jake Turner to the stand." Ella felt her pulse quicken. She had been waiting for this. Officer Turner, the lead investigator, was a critical piece of the prosecution's case. But Ella had spent the previous night reviewing every detail of his report, looking for inconsistencies. Bookmark, go back. Turner strode confidently to the witness stand, his uniform crisp and polished. He took the oath with practiced ease, then settled into his seat. Crane began his questioning with an air of familiarity, as though they were colleagues rather than prosecutors and witnesses. "Officer Turner, could you please describe your role in the investigation of the Coldwater grocery robbery?" Turner nodded. "Yes, sir. I was the first officer on the scene. I secured the area, interviewed witnesses, and collected evidence." "And what led you to identify Mia Thompson as a suspect?" Turner's gaze flicked toward Mia briefly before returning to Crane. "Based on the witness descriptions and the evidence we gathered, we were able to locate Miss Thompson. Her appearance matched the description given by the store clerk, and she was found in possession of cash that matched the amount stolen." Crane smiled as though Turner's words were irrefutable. "Thank you, Officer Turner. No further questions." Ella stood, smoothing her skirt as she approached the witness stand. Her tone was polite but firm. "Officer Turner, you mentioned that the store clerk's description led you to Miss Thompson. Could you clarify what that description was?" Turner straightened slightly, his expression cautious. "The clerk described the suspect as a young black woman, around 5'5", wearing dark clothing." Ella nodded thoughtfully. "How many young black women around 5'5" would you say live in Coldwater?" Turner blinked, clearly caught off guard. I don't know, ma'am." Ella pressed on, her voice calm but pointed. "More than one, would you say?" "Yes, probably," Turner admitted reluctantly. "So, the description alone could apply to several individuals in this town, correct?" Turner's jaw tightened. "Yes, but—" Ella held up a hand, cutting him off gently. "Let's talk about the evidence. You mentioned that Miss Thompson was found with cash that matched the amount stolen. How was this cash identified?" Turner hesitated, a faint flush creeping up his neck. The store had recorded serial numbers for some of the bills. They matched the ones in her possession. "Some of the bills?" Ella repeated, emphasizing the word. "Not all?" "No, not all," Turner admitted, his tone growing defensive. Ella nodded, her expression neutral. "And were these serial numbers recorded before or after the robbery?" "After," Turner said, his voice quieter. Ella allowed a brief pause, letting the jury absorb the implications. "So, it's possible that the records could have been inaccurate or tampered with, correct?" Crane shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. The defense is speculating." "Sustained," Judge Stanton said, his tone sharp. "Miss Green, stick to the facts." "Of course, Your Honor," Ella replied smoothly. She turned back to Turner, her tone unyielding. "Officer Turner, how many witnesses did you interview?" "3," Turner replied, his shoulders stiffening. "And did any of these witnesses see Miss Thompson inside the store, holding a weapon or taking money?" Turner hesitated, then shook his head. "No, they saw someone matching her description leaving the scene." "Someone matching her description," Ella repeated, her voice steady. "So, to be clear, no witness actually saw Miss Thompson committing the robbery?" "That's correct," Turner said through clenched teeth. Ella stepped back, her expression calm. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Ella returned to her seat, she could feel the subtle shift in the room. She had managed to poke holes in Turner's testimony, planting seeds of doubt in the jurors' minds. Mia leaned over, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think it's enough?" Ella placed a reassuring hand on her arm. "It's a start, but there's more work to do." The prosecution called another witness, Earl Simmons, the store clerk, for further questioning. Crane aimed to solidify Simmons's earlier testimony, hoping to counter the doubt Ella had introduced. "Mr. Simmons," Crane began, his tone gentle, "can you confirm that the person who robbed you was a young black woman?" "Yes, sir," Simmons said, though his voice wavered slightly. "And you're certain of this?" Simmons hesitated, glancing at Mia before nodding. "Yes, I'm sure." Ella stood for her cross-examination, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she approached the witness stand. Mr. Simmons, I understand that this experience was traumatic for you, and I appreciate your willingness to testify, she began, her voice calm and measured. But I need to clarify a few details. Simmons nodded nervously. Of course. You testified earlier that the suspect appeared nervous and scared. Is that correct? Yes, ma'am, Simmons replied, his hands fidgeting in his lap. And you mentioned that she had a gun, but you didn't get a clear look at it. Is that correct? Yes, Simmons admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Ella took a step closer, her expression softening. Mr. Simmons, are you absolutely certain that the person who robbed your store was Mia Thompson? Simmons froze, his eyes darting toward Crane for support. I think so, he stammered. Ella's tone remained gentle but firm. You think so, but you're not completely sure. Is that correct? Simmons swallowed hard, his eyes downcast. Yes, ma'am, it all happened so fast. Ella nodded, giving him a small reassuring smile. Thank you, Mr. Wright. Simmons. No further questions. As Ella returned to her seat, she could feel the tension in the room rising. The prosecution's case was beginning to unravel, but Ella knew they weren't finished. They would come back stronger, desperate to salvage their narrative. The courtroom recessed for lunch, and Ella stepped into the hallway, taking a moment to gather her thoughts. The air outside the courtroom felt heavy, charged with the weight of the trial. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see a young man approaching. He was tall, with a serious expression and a confident stride. Miss Green, he said, extending a hand. My name is David Caldwell. I'm with the local civil rights group here in Coldwater. Ella shook his hand, her curiosity piqued. It's good to meet you, David. What can I do for you? I just wanted to thank you, he said earnestly. What you're doing for Mia. It means a lot to all of us. This town has been stuck in its ways for too long. Ella smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Thank you, David. That means more than you know. If there's anything we can do to help, just say the word, David added. Ella nodded. I'll keep that in mind. As David walked away, Ella took a deep breath and turned back toward the courtroom. The real battle was still ahead, but she was ready. Ella Green re-entered the courtroom after the lunch recess. Her mind was razor-focused on what lay ahead. She knew the prosecution was on the defensive, scrambling to solidify their case. It was her chance to strike harder, to unravel the carefully constructed narrative that had painted Mia Thompson as a criminal. The bailiff called the court to order as Judge Stanton returned to his seat. His sharp gaze swept across the room, settling on Ella. Miss Green, he said, his voice measured. You may call your next witness. Ella rose, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Your Honor, the defense calls Rebecca Loring to the stand. A ripple of surprise swept through the room as a young woman with auburn hair and a nervous expression stood up from the back. Rebecca hesitated for a moment before walking toward the stand, her eyes darting around as though expecting resistance. Bookmark back. Rebecca took the oath, her hands trembling slightly as she settled into the witness chair. Ella approached her slowly, her tone warm and encouraging. Good afternoon, Miss Loring. Thank you for being here today. Rebecca nodded, her voice soft as she replied, Good afternoon. Ella began carefully, aware of how critical this testimony would be. Miss Loring, could you please state your relationship to this case? Rebecca swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. I was at Coldwater Grocery the night of the robbery. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the spectators. Across the room, Matthew Crane shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, he barked. This witness was not disclosed during discovery. Ella turned to Judge Stanton, her expression calm but firm. Your Honor, we only became aware of Miss Loring's testimony late last night. Given its importance and relevance, I believe the court should hear what she has to say. Judge Stanton leaned back in his chair, considering for a moment before nodding. Objection overruled. Proceed, Miss Green. Crane sank back into his seat, his frustration evident, while Ella turned back to Rebecca. Miss Loring, Ella continued, can you tell us what you witnessed that night? Rebecca took a shaky breath, her hands gripping the edges of the witness stand. I was in the back aisle when I heard voices near the front. It sounded like an argument. An argument? Ella echoed, her tone measured. Did you see who was involved in this argument? Rebecca nodded, her voice gaining a bit more strength. I saw a man arguing with the store clerk, Mr. Simmons. A man, Ella emphasized, letting the word hang in the air. Can you describe this man? Rebecca nodded again. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a dark hoodie. I couldn't see his face clearly, but he had a deep voice, and he sounded angry. Ella let the information settle with the jury before continuing. Did you see any women involved in this incident? No, Rebecca replied firmly. Just the 2 men. Crane shot to his feet again, his tone sharp. Objection, Your Honor. This testimony directly contradicts the established facts of the case. Judge Stanton's gaze hardened as he turned to Crane. Mr. Crane, you will have your chance to cross-examine. Sit down. Crane reluctantly complied, his jaw tightening as Ella pressed on. Miss Loring, Ella said, her tone softening, did you report what you saw to the police? Rebecca looked down, her expression heavy with guilt. No, I was scared. After the man ran out, I waited until things were quiet, and then I left too. I didn't want to get involved. What made you come forward now? Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes. I saw the news reports about Mia being arrested, and I knew it wasn't right. She wasn't there. I couldn't let an innocent person take the blame. Ella smiled gently, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for your courage, Miss Loring. No further questions. Crane was on his feet immediately, his expression cold as he approached Rebecca. Miss Loring, he began, his tone sharp, isn't it true that you have a history of mental health issues? Rebecca recoiled slightly, her eyes wide. I had some anxiety problems in the past, but nothing serious. And isn't it also true, Crane pressed, that you were dismissed from your job at Coldwater Pharmacy due to theft allegations? Ella rose instantly. Objection, Your Honor. The prosecution is badgering the witness and bringing up irrelevant information to discredit her. Judge Stanton raised a hand to silence the room. Overruled, but keep it relevant, Mr. Crane. Crane turned back to Rebecca, his tone icy. Miss Loring, answer the question. Were you accused of theft at your previous job? Rebecca's composure crumbled under the pressure. Yes, but I was cleared of those charges, she said, her voice quivering. But the fact remains, you were accused. Crane said, his words cutting. Why should this court believe anything you say? Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks and Ella rose to her feet again. Your Honor, the prosecution is harassing the witness. I request that this line of questioning be ended immediately. Judge Stanton's gavel struck sharply. Mr. Crane, wrap it up. Crane sneered but stepped back. No further questions. Rebecca fled the stand, sobbing quietly as she exited the courtroom. Ella's heart ached as she watched her go, but she knew the seed had been planted. The jury had heard the truth. The courtroom recessed briefly, giving Ella time to regroup. She sat alone at her table, going over her notes, when Officer James Denton, one of Turner's colleagues, approached cautiously. Miss Green, he said hesitantly, holding a tray of coffee and a sandwich, do you mind if I join you? Ella looked up, surprised but curious. Not at all. Denton sat down across from her, his demeanor nervous but earnest. I wanted to apologize for not coming forward sooner, he began, stirring his coffee absently. I've seen things in this department, things I should have spoken out about a long time ago. Ella's eyes narrowed slightly. You're talking about Turner, aren't you? Denton nodded, his expression grim. He's been cutting corners for years, manipulating evidence to fit his narrative. Most of us knew, but no one had the guts to stand up to him. Why now? Ella asked, her tone even. Denton sighed heavily. Because an innocent girl's life is on the line. I have a daughter around Mia's age. I couldn't live with myself knowing I stayed silent. Ella smiled softly, her voice sincere. Thank you, Officer Denton. Your testimony could make all the difference. Denton met her gaze, determination shining through. I hope so. And for what it's worth, there are good cops here in Coldwater who want to see justice done. Before Ella could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. Answering cautiously, she pressed the phone to her ear. Hello? A deep, unfamiliar voice responded. Miss Green, if you know what's good for you, you'll drop this case. Ella's blood ran cold. Who is this? Someone looking out for your best interests, the voice said ominously. Leave town now, or there will be consequences. The line went dead, and Ella lowered the phone slowly, her mind racing. Denton looked up, concern etched on his face. Everything okay? Ella took a steadying breath. Just another obstacle, nothing I can't handle. Denton's expression hardened. Be careful, Miss Green. These people play dirty. Ella's jaw set, her resolve unwavering. I know, but I'm not backing down. The morning sunlight filtered through the courthouse windows as Ella Green entered the courtroom for what she knew would be a critical day in the trial. The energy in the room was palpable, but something was different. The gallery was fuller than usual, with several unfamiliar faces. Word of Rebecca Loring's testimony and the defense's new evidence had spread throughout Coldwater, drawing the attention of activists, journalists, and curious townspeople alike. Ella could feel the shift. People started to question the case against Mia Thompson, and, by extension, the integrity of Coldwater's justice system. But with that change came resistance. As Ella settled at the defense table, Mia leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. There are so many people here today. Ella placed a reassuring hand on Mia's arm. That's a good thing. It means people are paying attention. Stay strong, Mia. We're making progress. Bookmark. Go back. Across the room, Prosecutor Matthew Crane sat stiffly at his table, his expression betraying the strain he was under. Officer Jake Turner was seated beside him, his usual smug demeanor replaced with something darker, barely concealed fury. Judge Stanton entered the courtroom, calling for order. Mr. Crane, he began, his voice sharp, is the prosecution ready to proceed? Crane stood, his movements mechanical as he addressed the court. Your Honor, the prosecution requests a brief recess before we continue. New evidence has come to light that requires immediate attention. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, and Ella immediately rose to her feet. Your Honor, the defense objects. We followed all proper procedures when presenting our evidence. Delaying now would be unjust to my client. Judge Stanton's expression hardened as he considered Crane's request. Finally, he shook his head. Objection sustained. The court will proceed as scheduled. Mr. Crane, you may call your next witness. Crane's jaw tightened, but he complied. Rising stiffly, he addressed the court. The prosecution calls Officer Jake Turner to the stand. Turner took the stand, his movements deliberate, his expression neutral but simmering with suppressed emotion. After being sworn in, Crane began his questioning. Officer Turner, Crane started, his voice steady, you were the lead investigator in the Coldwater grocery robbery. Can you confirm the steps you took in identifying Mia Thompson as the primary suspect? Turner nodded. Yes, sir. Based on the clerk's description, we began canvassing the area for anyone matching the suspect's profile. When we found Miss Thompson, her appearance and possession of cash matching the amount stolen confirmed our suspicions. And in your professional opinion, Crane pressed, was the evidence against Miss Thompson compelling? Yes, Turner replied confidently. The evidence left no doubt in my mind. Crane smiled faintly. No further questions. Ella stood slowly, her heels clicking against the floor as she approached the stand. She knew this cross-examination would be pivotal. Officer Turner, Ella began, her voice calm, you testified that the store clerk's description of the suspect led you to Miss Thompson. Can you remind the court what that description was? Turner straightened, his tone clipped. A young black woman, about 5'5", wearing dark clothing. And you stated earlier, Ella continued, pacing slightly, that this description could match several individuals in Coldwater. Is that correct? Turner hesitated, then nodded. Yes, but Miss Thompson was found with cash that matched the stolen money. Ella stopped pacing, her gaze sharp. The cash? Let's discuss that. You testified that some of the bills match serial numbers recorded by the store clerk. Were those numbers recorded before or after the robbery? Turner's expression tightened. After. So, Ella said, her voice steady, it's possible that these records could have been altered or contain errors, isn't it? Crane stood abruptly. Objection. Speculation. Sustained, Judge Stanton said firmly. Miss Green, move on. Of course, Your Honor, Ella replied. She turned back to Turner. Officer Turner, did you investigate any other suspects, or was Miss Thompson the only person you pursued? Turner hesitated again, a faint blush creeping up his neck. She was the primary suspect. Ella raised an eyebrow. Primary, or the only one? Turner's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Ella let the silence linger before stepping back. No further questions, Your Honor. As Ella returned to her seat, she could feel the subtle tension in the room. Turner's testimony had not landed as solidly as the prosecution had hoped. The cracks in the case were growing wider. The court recessed for a brief break, and Ella stepped outside for some fresh air. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and activists, their voices blending into a cacophony of questions and conversations. "Ms. Green," a reporter called, shoving a microphone toward her. "Do you think Rebecca Loring's testimony will change the course of the trial?" Ella offered a polite but firm smile. "I believe the truth always has the power to change things. That's what we're here to uncover." Before the reporter could press further, a familiar voice called out, "Ella." Turning, Ella saw David Caldwell approaching. The young activist's expression was a mix of excitement and concern. "David," Ella greeted him, stepping aside to speak privately. "What's going on?" "Word about the trial is spreading fast," David said, his tone serious. "There's a lot of support for Mia, but some folks aren't happy about what you're doing." Ella folded her arms, her expression unyielding. "Let me guess, threats?" David nodded. "Some of the old guards in this town don't want things to change. They see this trial as a threat to the way things have always been." Ella sighed, her resolve hardening. "Let them talk. I didn't come here to make friends. I came here to fight for justice." David's eyes lit with admiration. "Just be careful, okay? If you need anything, we've got your back." "Thank you, David," Ella said sincerely. "That means a lot." Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more charged. The prosecution called a few additional witnesses, but their testimonies were vague or contradicted earlier statements. Ella seized every opportunity to highlight these inconsistencies during cross-examination, further eroding the prosecution's case. As the day drew to a close, Judge Stanton adjourned court for the evening. Ella packed her files, her mind racing with strategies for the following day. Mia sat quietly beside her, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Do you think we're winning?" she asked softly. Ella paused, meeting Mia's gaze. "We're making progress," she said firmly, "but we're not done yet." As they exited the courthouse together, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the square. The tension in the air was heavy, but Ella felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the tide was starting to turn. The courthouse was packed to capacity as the final day of Mia Thompson's trial began. The air buzzed with tense energy, every person in the gallery knowing that the case had reached its climax. Ella Green sat at the defense table, her notes meticulously organized in front of her. Across the room, Matthew Crane appeared stoic, but the faint lines of strain around his eyes betrayed his unease. Mia sat beside Ella, her hands clasped tightly together. She looked exhausted, her usually soft features drawn with anxiety. Ella leaned over and whispered, "No matter what happens, Mia, we've done everything we could." Mia nodded, her voice trembling as she replied, "I just want this to be over." Ella gave her a reassuring squeeze on the arm before turning her focus to the judge, who entered the courtroom and called it to order. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Stanton began, his voice firm, "today we will hear closing arguments from both the prosecution and the defense. Following that, the jury will retire to deliberate. I remind everyone in this courtroom to maintain decorum." He nodded toward Crane. "Mr. Crane, you may proceed." Crane rose slowly, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury box. His voice was measured, and each word was carefully chosen for impact. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, pacing slightly, "you have heard the evidence, seen the witnesses, and listened to the testimony. The facts of this case are clear. Mia Thompson was at Coldwater Grocery the night of the robbery. She was found with money matching the amount stolen, and she fits the description provided by the store clerk." He stopped, turning to face the jury directly. "This is not about race, nor is it about bias. It's about justice. A crime was committed, and someone must be held accountable. The evidence points unequivocally to Mia Thompson." Crane's tone grew firmer, his words punctuated by deliberate pauses. "To ignore this evidence, to let the defendant go free, would send a message that crime has no consequence. I urge you to consider the facts, set aside any doubts, and return a verdict of guilty." He returned to his seat, his expression one of quiet confidence. Ella knew that look. Crane believed he had delivered the final blow. Ella rose slowly, her movements deliberate as she approached the jury. She had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was here, she spoke from the heart. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady but filled with quiet passion, You've heard the prosecution's version of events, but I ask you to look beyond the surface, to question what you've been told. This case is not as simple as the prosecution would like you to believe. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Mia Thompson is not a criminal, Ella continued, her gaze sweeping across the jury. She is a young woman caught in a system that is flawed, a system that often prioritizes expediency over truth. The evidence against her is circumstantial, riddled with inconsistencies and gaps that cannot be ignored. Ella stepped closer to the jury box, her voice softening. Think about the witnesses you've heard. Earl Simmons admitted he wasn't certain of the suspect's identity. Officer Turner revealed that no other suspects were investigated. And Rebecca Loring provided testimony that completely contradicts the prosecution's narrative, supported by new evidence, a video showing another individual fleeing the scene. She paused, letting her words sink in. This isn't just about Mia. It's about what kind of justice we believe in. Is it one that punishes based on assumption, or is it one that demands proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Ella took a deep breath, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Mia Thompson deserves better than to be another statistic in a broken system. She deserves fairness, she deserves truth, and I am confident that when you look at the facts, truly look at them, you will find her not guilty. Ella returned to her seat, her heart pounding. She had done all she could. The rest was in the hands of the jury. Judge Stanton's voice broke the tense silence. The jury will now retire to deliberate. As the jurors filed out of the courtroom, the weight of uncertainty settled over the room. Ella leaned back in her chair, exhaustion washing over her. Beside her, Mia sat rigid, her hands trembling as she fidgeted with the hem of her sleeve. The hours dragged on, each passing minute heightening the tension in the courtroom. Ella tried to focus on her notes, but her thoughts kept drifting to Mia. To her family, who sat anxiously in the gallery. To the years of systemic bias they were up against. Finally, the courtroom doors opened, and the jurors filed back in. The room fell into a hushed silence, every gaze fixed on the foreman as he stood to deliver the verdict. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Stanton asked. The foreman nodded. "We have, Your Honor." Ella's heart pounded in her chest as the foreman unfolded a piece of paper, his expression unreadable. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Mia Thompson." He paused, the silence stretching unbearably. "Not guilty." For a moment the words hung in the air, almost too surreal to believe. Then the room erupted. Gasps and cheers filled the courtroom while others muttered in disbelief. Mia sat frozen, her eyes wide with shock. "Mia," Ella said softly, placing a hand on her arm, "you're free." Tears spilled down Mia's cheeks as the realization hit her. I can't believe it," she whispered. "Thank you, Ella. Thank you for everything." Ella pulled her into a tight embrace, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You deserve this, Mia. You deserve justice." Across the room, Matthew Crane sat slumped in his chair, his expression a mix of frustration and defeat. Ella caught his eye briefly, offering a silent acknowledgement of the battle they had fought. As the courtroom began to clear, reporters swarmed around Ella, their questions overlapping in a chaotic flurry. She held up a hand, signaling for quiet. "This verdict is more than a victory for Mia Thompson," Ella said, her voice clear and firm. "It's a victory for justice, for truth, and for everyone who has ever been wrongfully accused." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "But our work doesn't stop here. There is still so much to be done to ensure that no one else has to endure what Mia has been through. I will continue to fight for justice, not just for my clients, but for all those who have been silenced by a broken system." With that, Ella turned back to Mia and her family, guiding them out of the courtroom. The weight of the case had lifted, but Ella knew this was only one battle in a much larger fight. As they stepped into the evening air, the sun setting over Coldwater, Ella felt a sense of resolution. The tide was turning. Justice had prevailed, for now. The verdict in Mia Thompson's trial sent shockwaves through Coldwater. For a town that had long clung to its traditions, no matter how flawed, the outcome felt like the first crack in an unyielding wall. Over the following weeks, the ripple effects of the trial became impossible to ignore. Ella Green returned to her office, her name now circulating far beyond Coldwater as a symbol of courage and determination. Calls flooded in from reporters, activists, and individuals seeking her representation. Yet despite the growing attention, Ella's focus remained on the people of Coldwater, especially Mia. Mia had returned home to her family, but the scars of her ordeal remained. Ella visited her one evening, stepping onto the modest front porch of the Thompson household. The door opened before Ella could knock, revealing Mia's mother, Clara, her face lighting up at the sight of the attorney. "Ella," Clara greeted warmly, pulling her into a hug. "Come in, please." Inside, the house was cozy, filled with the faint aroma of home-cooked food. Mia sat on the couch, her younger siblings sprawled around her, their laughter breaking the somber tension that had hung over the family for months. "Ella," Mia exclaimed, standing to greet her. "I didn't think you'd come by." Ella smiled. "Of course I would. How are you holding up?" Mia hesitated before replying. "Better. It's still hard sometimes, especially when I think about how close I was to losing everything." Ella placed a comforting hand on Mia's shoulder. "You're stronger than you think, Mia, and you're not alone. This community is starting to see the truth, thanks to you." Indeed, Coldwater was changing. Inspired by the trial's revelations, local activists and community leaders began pushing for reforms. David Caldwell, the young activist who had supported Ella during the trial, invited her to speak at a town hall meeting. The meeting was held in the newly renovated community center, a space that had once been neglected but now served as a hub for change. Ella arrived to find a standing room-only crowd, the energy in the room electric. David greeted her at the entrance, his face glowing with enthusiasm. "Ella, you have no idea how much your work has inspired people here." Ella offered a modest smile. "It's not just me, David. This is about all of us." As the meeting began, Ella took the stage to a round of applause. She looked out over the crowd, seeing familiar faces from the trial, as well as new ones, people who had been galvanized by Mia's story. "Thank you for having me," Ella began, her voice carrying across the room. "The trial we just endured wasn't just about Mia Thompson. It was about challenging a system that has failed too many for too long." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. But the fight for justice doesn't end with one case. It's a continuous effort, and it requires all of us to stand up, to speak out, and to demand better. The crowd erupted in applause, and Ella felt a swell of pride. Change was slow, but it was happening. However, not everyone in Coldwater welcomed this change. In the weeks following the trial, tensions flared in certain corners of the town. Some residents viewed the trial's outcome as a threat to their way of life, clinging to the old systems that had allowed them to maintain power and control. One evening, as Ella was leaving her office, she found a threatening note taped to her car windshield. The message was scrawled in harsh, jagged letters. "You don't belong here. Leave now before it's too late." Ella stared at the note for a long moment, her chest tightening. But fear quickly gave way to determination. She carefully folded the note and tucked it into her bag. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to intimidate her, and she doubted it would be the last. But if they thought a piece of paper could deter her, they were sorely mistaken. The next day, Ella met with Officer James Denton, the officer who had bravely testified against his colleague during the trial. Denton had since become a whistleblower, shedding light on the patterns of misconduct within the Coldwater Police Department. "Thanks for meeting me," Denton said as they sat in a quiet corner of a local diner. "Of course," Ella replied. "How are you holding up?" Denton sighed, stirring his coffee absently. "It hasn't been easy. Turner's suspension caused a lot of backlash in the department. Some of my colleagues think I betrayed them." "You didn't betray anyone," Ella said firmly. "You told the truth. That's what matters." Denton nodded, though his expression remained somber. "I just hope it leads to real change." "It already has," Ella assured him. "And it will continue to, as long as people like you are willing to stand up." Their conversation turned to the next steps: what reforms were needed, how to ensure accountability, and how to rebuild trust between the police and the community. Meanwhile, Mia began to find her voice as well. Encouraged by Ella and David, she agreed to share her story publicly, hoping to inspire others who had faced injustice. At a community rally held in the town square, Mia stood in front of a microphone, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger as she spoke. For months, I thought no one would believe me, she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. I thought I was alone. But thanks to people like Miss Green, and thanks to all of you, I know I'm not. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Mia stepped back from the microphone, tears streaming down her face. Ella stood nearby, her chest swelling with pride. As the weeks turned into months, Coldwater began to transform. The police department implemented new training programs aimed at addressing bias and improving community relations. Local activists worked tirelessly to ensure that marginalized voices were heard in town hall meetings and government decisions. Ella remained at the forefront of these efforts, splitting her time between her legal work and community advocacy. She became a mentor to young lawyers, sharing the lessons she had learned in Coldwater with a new generation of legal minds. One afternoon, as she walked through the revitalized community center, David Caldwell approached her with a bright smile. "Can you believe this?" he said, gesturing to the bustling activity around them. "A year ago, none of this felt possible." Ella smiled. "It's amazing what people can accomplish when they come together." David nodded, his expression turning serious. "And it's because of you, Ella. You showed us what was possible." Ella shook her head. "It wasn't just me, David. It was all of us." Though the work in Coldwater was far from finished, Ella couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. The trial had been the catalyst, but the real victory was the change it had sparked, a change that would ripple through the town for generations. As she left the community center that evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over Coldwater. For the first time in a long time, the town felt like it was moving towards something brighter, something better. And Ella knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would be there, fighting for justice, one case at a time. Several months had passed since the trial of Mia Thompson, but the ripples of that momentous case continued to shape the town of Coldwater. What had begun as a courtroom battle had evolved into a broader reckoning, forcing the community to confront the biases and injustices it had long ignored. Ella Green stood outside the courthouse one crisp autumn morning, looking up at the familiar white columns. This place, which had once symbolized so much prejudice, now held a more complex meaning. It was where Mia's name had been cleared, where the town's deep-seated flaws had been laid bare, and where the seeds of change had been planted. Inside, the atmosphere was markedly different. Community members bustled about, organizing documents and preparing for a meeting. The courthouse had become a hub for discussions about reform, and Ella had been invited to speak on the progress Coldwater had made since the trial. As she walked through the familiar halls, Ella passed David Caldwell, who was setting up chairs in the meeting room. He waved her over, his face lit with the same energy she had come to admire. "Ella," David called out. "Glad you could make it. This turnout is going to be incredible." Ella smiled, taking in the sight of the diverse crowd already gathering. "It's amazing to see so many people involved," she said. "It wasn't long ago that this town didn't even want to acknowledge there was a problem." David nodded. "And now we're talking about police reform, education equity, and community accountability, all because of you." Ella shook her head. "Because of us, David. It takes a community to make real change." The meeting began with Ella taking the podium, the room falling silent as she addressed the crowd. "When I first came to Coldwater," Ella began, her voice steady and clear, "I was met with suspicion, hostility, and outright resistance. I didn't come here looking for a fight, but I found myself in the middle of one, a fight for justice, not just for Mia Thompson, but for everyone in this town who has ever been denied fairness and equality." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the audience. "Today, we see the beginnings of change. We see a community coming together to address its flaws, to make amends, and to build a better future. But let's not forget, this is only the beginning. The road ahead is long, and it will take all of us working together to ensure that Coldwater becomes a place where justice truly belongs to everyone." The room erupted in applause, and Ella stepped back, her heart swelling with hope. Later that evening, as Ella walked through the town square, she reflected on how far Coldwater had come. The square, once a place of whispered judgments and exclusion, now felt vibrant and welcoming. The small businesses lining the streets had signs promoting diversity and inclusion, and families of all backgrounds gathered in the park to enjoy the cool evening air. Ella found herself at the edge of the park, where a small memorial had been erected, a plaque honoring individuals who had fought for justice in the town's history. Mia Thompson's name was there, alongside others who had faced adversity and helped pave the way for progress. Makes you proud, doesn't it? Ella turned to see Clara Thompson standing beside her, a warm smile on her face. It does, Ella replied. Mia's story changed everything. Clara nodded. And she couldn't have done it without you. You gave her a voice when she thought no one would listen. Ella smiled, her voice soft. She had the strength all along. I just helped her find it. Not everyone in Coldwater embraced the changes with open arms. The old guard, those who had benefited from the town's long-standing inequities, continued to push back. Anonymous threats still arrived at Ella's office from time to time, and there were murmurs of dissent at town hall meetings. But Ella wasn't deterred. If anything, the resistance only strengthened her resolve. She knew that real change was never easy, and she was prepared to face whatever challenges came next. Her work in Coldwater inspired her to take on cases in neighboring towns where similar battles needed to be fought. Yet no matter where her work took her, Ella remained deeply connected to Coldwater, visiting often to mentor young attorneys, collaborate with activists, and support community initiatives. One afternoon, Ella received an unexpected visitor at her office. It was Mia Thompson, dressed in a smart blazer and carrying a small portfolio. Mia, Ella greeted her warmly, motioning for her to sit. It's so good to see you. What brings you by? Mia smiled, her expression a mix of nerves and excitement. I wanted to thank you again for everything, and I wanted to share some news. Ella leaned forward, curious. What's going on? I've decided to go to law school, Mia said, her voice firm and determined. I want to help people the way you helped me. Ella's eyes widened with pride. Mia, that's incredible. You're going to make an amazing lawyer. Mia nodded, her smile growing. I've seen what injustice looks like up close, and I want to be part of the solution. Ella reached across the desk, taking Mia's hands in hers. You already are. On the anniversary of the trial's verdict, the town held a celebration in the town square, commemorating the progress Coldwater had made and honoring the people who had fought for change. Ella was invited to speak once again, this time as a guest of honor. Standing before the crowd, Ella took a deep breath, the warm evening air carrying the sounds of laughter and music. When I think about where we were a year ago, she began, it's hard to believe how far we've come. Coldwater isn't perfect, no place is, but it's on a path towards something better. And that's because of you. Because of the people who refused to stay silent. Because of the people who chose to act. She gestured toward Mia, who stood in the crowd beside her family. People like Mia Thompson, who turned her pain into purpose. People like all of you, who continue to fight for what's right. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Ella stepped back, feeling a profound sense of fulfillment. As the celebration wound down, Ella stood on the edge of the square, watching as families packed up picnic blankets and children chased fireflies. David Caldwell approached her, his face glowing with gratitude. Ella, he said, you've done more for this town than anyone could have imagined. Ella shook her head. We all did this together, David. Coldwater's future belongs to its people. David smiled. And because of you, we believe in that future. As Ella walked away from the square, the sounds of the celebration fading into the night, she felt a deep sense of peace. She knew there would always be more work to do, more cases to take, more voices to amplify, more battles to fight. But for now, she allowed herself to savor this moment. Coldwater was changing, and so was the world. One step at a time. The story of Ella Green and Mia Thompson is not just about a trial. It's a mirror reflecting the deep-seated challenges of injustice and prejudice in society. Through Ella's unwavering resolve, we see the power of courage and integrity in dismantling systemic biases. Her journey reminds us that standing up for what is right often requires persistence and resilience, especially when the odds seem insurmountable. Mia's transformation from a victim of the system to an empowered individual demonstrates the importance of support, advocacy, and believing in oneself. The trial did not just prove Mia's innocence. It ignited a movement in Coldwater that highlighted the importance of community solidarity in fostering change. This story offers a vital lesson. Change begins when individuals refuse to accept the status quo. Ella's determination and the town's eventual transformation remind us that even in the face of resistance, justice is worth fighting for. If you found this story inspiring, let us know. Comment 1 if you found the story meaningful. Comment 2 if it deeply moved you. We'd love to hear your own stories of courage and perseverance. Share them in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more inspirational stories like this. Bookmark, what are your thoughts on Ella and Mia's journey? Drop your opinions in the comments, and let's start a conversation about justice and hope.